Chicago, February 1968. A man is found bleeding on a South Side street, beaten in a fight over a dice game. He is 37 years old. He will not see morning. Rock and roll had just lost one of its inventors. He took a $10 Hohner harp and turned it into an instrument that could scream and roar like a saxophone, creating a sound that legends like the Rolling Stones would study note for note. His name was Little Walter. He remains the single most important harmonica player in history, and as the facts of his life show, he was the architect of his own destruction. The same aggressive fire that made his music unforgettable was precisely what made his life so dangerous. It was a creative superpower and a fatal flaw. Marion Walter Jacobs was born in 1930 in rural Louisiana, where the Mississippi Delta bleeds into the bayou. He left school by the age of 12 and left home shortly after. He drifted through New Orleans, Helena, and Memphis, teaching himself the harmonica by ear, by instinct, and by relentless daily practice. He was small and wiry, but he carried a personality that didn't match his frame. Even as a teenager, his temper could flare into a physical confrontation without warning. While his ambition was massive, it was limited by the instrument itself. At the time, an acoustic harmonica was simply too quiet to lead a band. It was destined to stay in the background. In 1946, Walter headed north. He arrived in Chicago as part of the Great Migration, carrying his Southern blues into the industrial North. He landed at the Maxwell Street market, a chaotic open-air bazaar that served as a free concert for dozens of musicians, all competing for the crowd's attention and their coins. To be heard over the market's noise, Walter had to solve a volume problem. His acoustic playing was being completely drowned out by the city. His solution was to cup a small microphone in his hands alongside the harmonica itself, creating a tight seal between his palms and the instrument. He ran that microphone through a guitar amplifier and pushed it into overdrive. The amp distorted the signal, giving it a grit and sustain that no acoustic harmonica could ever produce. This hack transformed the instrument. It no longer just colored the edges of a band, it led them. It was a screaming, distorted force that mirrored Walter's own aggressive personality. This loud, dominant sound landed Walter a spot in Muddy Waters' band. Together, they became the defining sound of the Chicago blues explosion. In 1952, during a session with Muddy, the band had extra time and recorded a warm-up riff Walter had been playing. They titled it Juke. This chart shows the anomaly. Juke hit #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and stayed there for months. It is the only pure harmonica instrumental to ever top a national chart in American history. At 22 years old, Walter was a headliner. He left Muddy to lead his own band, touring the country as a star. He was young, wealthy, and famous, but he also possessed a violent, unrestrained temper, and that combination was becoming a recipe for disaster. Through the 1950s, he released a string of hits like My Babe and Mean Old World. These tracks effectively wrote the vocabulary for every blues and rock harmonica player who followed. But the pressure of stardom on the Chitlin circuit caused his volatility to spike. He wasn't just demanding in the studio, he was becoming dangerous on the road. He began drinking heavily and actively seeking out physical altercations in the rough nightclubs where he performed. He was alienating his peers and constantly looking for a fight. The same aggressive, rule-breaking fire that allowed him to reinvent his instrument was now burning down his life. By 1968, the global influence of his music had reached its peak, yet Walter himself was dying alone over a dice game. His end was the final result of a life lived at maximum, uncontrolled volume. He was a musical shooting star whose career ended as violently as the distorted riffs he pioneered. Every time we hear the loud, overdriven wail of a harmonica today, we are listening to the brilliant, doomed fire of Little Walter. On the night of February 14, 1968, a 37-year-old man was involved in a game of dice and an argument that turned physical on Chicago's South Side. The fight left him with injuries to his head. He didn't go to the hospital. He simply went home to sleep. By the early hours of the following morning, a blood clot resulting from that trauma killed him. There was no dramatic deathbed scene and no headline-grabbing crime investigation. Little Walter simply went to sleep in an apartment on the west side and never woke up. The man who died that morning was responsible for the sound of the amplified blues. He had taken a small handheld instrument and turned it into a lead voice that could rival a saxophone or an electric guitar. He was buried at Restvale Cemetery in Alsep, Illinois. For years, his grave went unmarked, a final, quiet end for a man who had once topped the national charts. This is Little Walter. While his death barely registered outside the blues community at the time, he remains the most influential harmonica player to ever pick up the instrument. He proved the harmonica could lead a band and top a chart, creating a musical vocabulary that later became a cornerstone for rock and roll. The silence at his grave mirrored the volatility of his life. The same intensity that allowed him to reinvent his instrument often made it impossible for him to live among those who played it. Walter was known for a short fuse. Musicians who worked with him described a man who could be generous one moment and explosively violent the next. This vintage bullet-style microphone resting on a tweed amplifier represents his technical breakthrough. On Maxwell Street, Walter began running his microphone through a tube amp to create a heavy, snarly distortion, a sound that didn't exist before him. But that same aggression followed him off the stage. He was quick to draw a knife or a gun over a perceived insult, a bad hand of cards, or a heavy night of drinking. This lifestyle left him with visible scars on his face from a lifetime of physical altercations. He was in and out of fights for most of his adult life. The distorted sound of his records was the sonic translation of that temper. The revolutionary music and the violent reality were inseparable. By the early 1960s, the popularity of Chicago blues began to cool in the United States. Walter's record sales declined, and his live bookings grew less steady. As his professional career slowed, his drinking deepened. This only worsened his temper, making him increasingly difficult to book or manage. Bandmates came and went, and promoters grew wary. He was still a working musician, but his trajectory was clearly downward. Right before his death, he was still touring and occasionally recording, but everyone around him could see the decline. His death on a Chicago street wasn't a sudden change of course. It was the final spark of a fuse that had been burning since he was a teenager in Helena, Arkansas. While Walter's career faded at home, his work lived on through Chess Records imports. These records became a blueprint for a new generation of musicians across the Atlantic. During the British blues and rock explosion, bands like the Yardbirds worshipped Walter's style. They adopted his aggressive, overdriven sound and brought it to a global audience. Every rock harmonica solo that snarls instead of whimpers is working in the language Walter invented with spare change and a broken amplifier on Maxwell Street. While the American mainstream barely noticed his passing, these bands ensured his musical approach would be canonized. Decades after he was buried in an unmarked grave, fans and musicians raised the money for a proper headstone. It finally gave him the credit that his own self-destructive nature had denied him in life. In 2008, 40 years after his death, Little Walter was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. One of the only artists ever enshrined primarily as a harmonica player. It was a recognition that came too late to matter to the man, but it confirmed the transformation of the instrument he left behind. Little Walter showed that the harmonica could lead a band and top a chart. He also showed how the very same fire that makes an artist's work unforgettable can be the thing that brings their life to a premature end.